Hi everyone, today we'll be presenting on the topic of the ripple effect, how the US housing crisis shook Iceland's economy. We'll start by taking a look at the US housing bubble that ultimately led to the global financial crisis of 2008. Moving on, we'll delve into some background information on Iceland and we'll examine the causes of the crisis on how Iceland's economy was affected by it. Next, we'll discuss the immediate and long-term impact of the crisis on Iceland. We also take a closer look at the policy responses that were implemented. And finally, we'll conclude by exploring what we can learn from Iceland's experience. So without further ado, let's get started. So the US financial crisis of 2008 was a major economic downturn that was triggered by a combination of factors, including a housing bubble, risky lending practices, and a lack of oversight and regulation in the financial sector. At the heart of the crisis was the US housing market. In the years leading up to the crisis, housing prices had soared to record levels, fueled by lower interest rates and a surge in demand for housing. This led to a housing bubble where prices were artificially inflated beyond their true market value. Bank and other financial institutions were eager to capitalize on the booming housing market, and they began to engage in increasingly risky lending practices. These included issuing subprime mortgages. These mortgages were often packaged together and sold to investors in the form of mortgage-backed securities, which were supposed to be low-risk investments. However, as the housing market began to cool and home prices began to fall, many borrowers found themselves unable to make their mortgages payments. This led to a surge in foreclosures, which caused the value of mortgage-backed securities to plummet. This in turn had a ripple effect through the financial system as banks and other financial institutions that had invested heavily in these securities began to experience massive losses.
Now we're going to give some background information about Iceland. Iceland had a small open economy that was heavily reliant on the banking sector before the crisis. This banking sector gave it a very rapidly growth on the years leading up the crisis, which led to a significant expansion and increase in exposure to the global financial markets. Iceland's economy was highly interconnected with the global financial system, which made it vulnerable to shocks in the global economy. From the early 2000s, Iceland's economy was experiencing a period rapid growth, with the country's GDP expanding by an average of 4.6% per year between 2000 and 2007. The growth was largely driven by the country's banking sector, which had expanded rapidly through a combination of aggressive lending and international expansion. The three largest banks of Iceland, these banks had been offering large loans to customers with little collateral, lending to a rapid expansion of the country's debt levels. By 2007, Iceland's external debt was reached over 900% in its GDP, making it one of the most in-debt countries in the world.
The US financial crisis of 2008 had significant global implications, including in Iceland. In the years leading up to the crisis, many Icelandic banks had aggressively expanded their operations and invested heavily in the US and European financial markets. As the crisis began to unfold, these investments quickly lost value, causing Iceland's banking system to collapse. However, when the US housing market collapsed, it had far-reaching consequences for Iceland's economy. The country's three largest banks had invested heavily in the US mortgage-backed securities, which became essentially worthless as the US housing market collapsed. As a result, Iceland's banking sector quickly became insolvent, with the country's central bank and government unable to provide the necessary liquidity to prevent a systematic crisis. Within a matter of days, all three of Iceland's largest banks had collapsed, leading to a severe financial crisis and a sharp contraction of the country's economy. This led to a severe recession, with the country's GDP shrinking by 10% in 2009. The impact of the crisis was also felt across Icelandic society. Unemployment skyrocketed, peaking at over 9% in 2009, and many Icelanders lost their life savings as a result of the banking collapse.
Now we're going to discuss some of the causes of the crisis. The US housing crisis was caused by a combination of factors, including lax lending standards, a housing bubble, and complex financial instruments. These factors created a situation where many subprime borrowers in the US were unable to repay their mortgages, leading to a wave of foreclosure and decline in housing prices. The crisis particularly affected Iceland due to its high exposure to the global financial markets and reliance on the banking sector for economic growth. One of the main factors that contributed to the crisis in Iceland was the liberalization of the financial sector in the 1990s. Iceland began in its financial markets opening the door of the rapid expansion of its banking sector. This expansion was fueled in part by the easy availability of cheap foreign capital, which Iceland banks used to make the leverage investment in overseas markets, particularly in Europe and the United States. Another factor that contributed to the crisis in Iceland was the growth of country's housing market. Like in the United States, Icelandic banks began offering subprime mortgages. These loans were packaged into mortgage-backed securities and sold to investors around the world, creating a global market of Iceland debt. In addition, Icelandic banks engaged in an aggressive lending practices, expanding leveraged large loans to Iceland businesses and individuals. The lending fueled a boom in the Iceland economy, but it also created a high level of debt for the banks and their borrowers. As the global financial crisis hit in 2008, Iceland's financial sector began to unravel. The country's banks had taken one huge levels of debt, both domestically and abroad, and were unable to meet their obligations.
Iceland's banking sector collapsed in 2008 as a result of the crisis, which led to a major economic recession. The value of the Icelandic krona fell sharply, inflation increased, and employment rose. The country's banking sector, which had been a major driver of economic growth, collapsed almost overnight. The three largest Icelandic banks, Kaupthing, Glitnir, and Landsbanki, were unable to meet their debt obligations and were effectively nationalized by the Icelandic government. Before the crisis, Iceland had one of the lowest unemployment rates in the world, averaging around 2 to 3%. However, in the aftermath of the crisis, unemployment rose sharply, peaking at 7.5% in 2010. The crisis also had this devastating impact on Iceland's currency, the Icelandic krona. In the years leading up to the crisis, the krona had depreciated significantly, reaching a high of $62 in 2007. By late 2008, the krona had lost over half of its value against major currencies like the euro and the dollar. The collapse of the banking sector also had a major impact on Icelandic public finances. The Icelandic government was forced to bail out the country's bank, which had taken on a huge level of debt. This caused Iceland's national debt to skyrocket, reaching a peak of over 2,250% of GDP in 2011. Also, housing prices in Iceland rose rapidly in the years leading up to the crisis, but fell sharply in the aftermath. According to the data from the Central Bank of Iceland, the average price of residential properties in Iceland fell by nearly 40% between 2008 and 2010. Finally, inflation increased significantly in the aftermath of the crisis, reaching a level of 18%, driven in part by the depreciation of the Icelandic krona and rising import prices.
This led to a more fragmented political landscape and ongoing challenges in forming stable governments.
In response to the financial crisis, the Icelandic government implemented a range of policy measures to stabilize the economy and mitigate the impact of the crisis on the population. One of the first measures taken by the government was to guarantee all domestic deposits in Icelandic banks. This helped to prevent a run on the banks and reassure the public that their savings were safe. The government also took steps to stabilize the Icelandic krona, including introducing capital controls to limit the outflow of capital from the country. The Icelandic government also provided liquidity support to the banking sector and took over the largest banks. To address the country's public finances, the government implemented a contractionary fiscal policy, including cuts to the public spending and tax increases. The aim of these measures was to reduce the country's budget deficit and bring down the level of public debt.
To finish, we will talk about some lessons and conclusions. So after the crisis, Iceland faced some challenges in dealing with its public debt, limiting its investment and in infrastructure and social programs. The government implemented spending cuts and tax increase to stabilize the country's finance. So Iceland also had to restructure its banking system, involving liquidating some banks and restructuring others and creating new regulatory frameworks. The crisis led to a widespread protest, and measures were taken to restore the public trust in the country's institutions and leaders throughout political system reforms and increased transparency. Despite the challenges, Iceland emerged stronger, having learned important lessons about the damage of relying on debt and financial speculations. Reforms were implemented to prevent similar crises, such as strengthening regulations, improving transparency, and investing in education and innovation. Thank you for watching.